Welcome to LGBTQ Northwest Indiana and PFLAG Crown Point TV.
We come to you every 2 weeks on Thursday, currently from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. Central.
We would like to thank our producer, The Bill and Callie Show, and also their sponsors.
Yes, thank you very much.
My name is Amari Victoria, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
My name is Elizabeth Menning. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and we're pleased to have a guest with us today. Alexandra?
Hi, I'm Alexandra. My pronouns are also she, her, hers, and I'm a first-year doctoral student at Adler University in Chicago and a PFLAG Crown Point intern.
Very
Wonderful.
good.
All right, so
Today we will present to you topics and news important to the LGBTQ and ally community members in Northwest Indiana.
whether you identify as LGBTQ, which of course is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning yourself, or you consider yourself an ally, you know somebody who is LGBTQ, or you just want to become a better ally, this show is for you.
Before we get into our feature presentation today, I have a few things I'd like to mention. First of all, I would like to thank those who were very generous towards LGBTQ Northwest Indiana and PFLAG Crown Point this past Tuesday on Giving Tuesday. We appreciate your support.
Very much. Thank you so much.
I would also like to mention the Indiana Quit Line, which is a smoking cessation in Indiana organization. Their number is 1-800-QUIT-NOW, and they provide services for those who are attempting to quit smoking or stop the use of tobacco. They have phone counseling and web-based services, self-help tools. They have some free medications, patch and gum, as well as other services. Again, that's 1-800-QUIT-NOW. I'd also like to mention the National Suicide Prevention Hotline number in case you are feeling bad and you need some help. And that number is 800-273-8255.
And help is just a phone call away. So please, if you are having any feelings of strong depression or considering suicide, please reach out and make a call. Where people are definitely there to help. So our feature presentation, we're very excited that Alexandra has joined us. For both PFLAG Crown Point and LGBTQ Northwest Indiana, we're fortunate to have a small group of volunteers who have reached out to us and are now busy doing different projects for us. As well, we have a group of interns from 2 different universities. And as Alexandra mentioned, she is an intern with us this year from Adler. And she has been doing a really great job, both with our social media posting and with educational presentations for our support groups. And this one that we are highlighting today is on asexuality. And we are just pleased to be able to present this to you. I hope it provides some education and helps you understand more, either about yourself or someone you know. And definitely, if you have any questions after, just reach out to us. So Alexandra, you want to talk a little bit about your background and how you came around to doing this presentation?
Yeah, so when I was an undergraduate, I went to Michigan State University and I had to do an honors thesis as part of my graduation requirements in the Honors College. And I thought about it and I wanted to do something that fit kind of with my personal identities. And there's not a lot of research on asexuality, so that's what I went with. And specifically, I studied asexuals in romantic relationships. That was more of my interest, as we'll kind of get into later. There are different levels of attraction and people can identify with different sexual and romantic orientations. And yes, that was my thesis, which we did not publish, but I'll share some more about it. And as well, we did some further work on it. I collected a rather large data set, and that was presented at the Society for Social Psychology and Personality Research Convention, which was in New Orleans earlier this year, which I was not in attendance, but my faculty team was there for me. And so we've done a lot of work on it, and I think it was a big success sort of for the asexual community, getting some more research out there, and also just serving a larger population than most studies have in the past. So that's kind of my background with it.
I know it's one of the lesser well-known sexualities. And Mari, maybe before we jump into that, do you want to kind of refresh people's minds on the difference between?
You may recall, perhaps you don't recall, but many episodes ago, we spent 2 or 3 episodes describing gender identity and gender expression and sexual orientation in great detail. I don't have the episode numbers in my mind at the moment, but if you were to go back to some of the very first ones, you would find them. And today, Alexandra is going to talk about one that we, at that point in time, covered probably very briefly, asexuality.
All right. So Alexandra, go through your presentation. We might jump in with questions, so we'll try to be polite about it.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, okay. So broadly defined, asexuality is a lack of sexual attraction and a lack of desire towards sexual relationships. So this is an intrinsic identity, not a choice. Most people don't desire to act upon sexual attraction or engage in these relationships in any way. The asexual spectrum includes many diverse identities, as asexuals do have different needs, pursue different relationships, and have different levels of attraction and arousal. So even though asexuality is broadly a lack of sexual attraction, there's a lot of variance in this spectrum, and underneath this umbrella, so to speak. I'll go over some of those terms in a moment, some of the more common ones, but there are asexuals who do have different levels of attraction and arousal and may pursue some of these activities. It's estimated that 1% of the population is asexual, but this may be an underestimate due to early research only focusing on people who were fully asexual, let's say, completely lacking sexual attraction, as opposed to some of the spectrum identities out there. So it's thought that that number could be much higher if those were accounted for.
Okay, I have a couple of questions real quick, Alexandra. One, you mentioned that it's an intrinsic identity, not a choice. So what we understand by that is that people are born this way. It is part of yourself. It is an innate characteristic. Am I getting that right for what you were saying?
Yes, so much like other identities of the LGBTQ plus community, it is an intrinsic identity, something you're born with, not something that is maybe commonly stereotyped that you're choosing to do, or going with some new phase or trend. It's a part of who you are. So
great. Then I think one other thing I wanted to throw in there is Alexandra, you mentioned spectrum, and it's a good reminder that we're starting as a society to see that sexuality and attraction and gender are not just on a binary, on a male, female, or gay, straight. It's on a spectrum, and there's a whole range of things in there. So that's one I just wanted to say for our viewers. So,
and I just like to mention one more thing, and that is that the colors of the heart are the colors that you would find on the asexual flag.
yes.
Yes, and I agree. The spectrum notion is very important, especially for this community. I find there are a lot of umbrella terms or terms under the umbrella. I'm only going to go over a few common ones, but there are a lot out there for people who are interested in pursuing some more of those labels, or maybe want to learn more about themselves or others.
Great. And I know you have a resource available describing some of those.
Yes, yeah, towards the end, yes. So there's quite a few asexual spectrum identities, as I mentioned. Most common ones being demisexual, someone who does not experience sexual attraction until they've formed a deep emotional connection. Gray sexuality, someone who relates to asexuality but has experiences not fully described by asexuality. So just kind of fluctuations in those attractions that I talked about. Maybe some interest in sexual relationships, but not always. And then phrase sexuality, someone who only experiences sexual attraction towards people they don't have a connection with and lose that attraction as they get to know people, which is the opposite of demisexuality. So as you can see as well, these can all be combined with other orientations. You can use them alongside other labels, particularly in the asexuality community. It's common to use them with romantic labels. So that's just something to keep in mind. You don't have to just pick one thing.
And it's not required to pick up one of these labels either. This is just another way of understanding the nuances.
Right, that too. That's why some people just broadly identify as being on the asexual spectrum. Some people might say queer, gray sexuality more broadly, or, you know, no label at all. So there's a lot of options.
Okay. And those flags on the left represent those sexualities then?
Yes, in order also. So there's a lot of flags for the community too, underneath that original one we showed. And continuing with some further identities, ace flux, a changing sexual orientation that usually stays on the asexual spectrum, but not always, it doesn't have to. Lithosexual, someone who may experience sexual attraction but does not want it reciprocated and doesn't seek out those relationships. So they may be uncomfortable if someone is sexually attracted to them, or lose feelings if they learn theirs are reciprocated. And then autochorisexual is someone who has a disconnected view between themselves and the subject of arousal, so like a third person view of sexual activity. And this one is actually has been researched a little bit. So unlike some of the other spectrum identities here, that's just interesting to note that it's gotten some attention.
So really, this is a wide spectrum, maybe even further than that. It's sort of a galaxy of identities and a galaxy of labels that we can incorporate into our own identities.
Yeah, as the asexual community mostly originated online, lots of these labels came about in those communities, such as the Asexual Visibility and Education Network, Tumblr, with people creating these flags and coming up with labels for their community. So it almost seems like an endless amount sometimes. That's why I couldn't include them all. But it shows that those labels were necessary for people to create in the process of discovering themselves. And that's why they tend to be more common in some of those niche online communities, because that's where they started.
Okay.
And in addition to that, so asexuals can have different sexual feelings. So in general, they can be sex ambivalent and have mixed feelings towards sex, sex favorable and enjoy sex or the concept of it. They can seek out experiences of these attractions, even if they don't experience the attraction, as sexual behavior is different from orientation itself. Sex repulsed, so finding sex disgusting or repulsive, and then sex indifferent, having no strong feelings about sex one way or the other. So they can also differ on this dimension as well.
And so when you say asexual sexual feeling, that's one person could have several. At one time they could be sex repulsed, another time they could be sex indifferent.
I suppose I haven't read like too much about that, but I would assume your labels could change kind of as all labels can change, or maybe you would just be more sex ambivalent overall and kind of fluctuate between like mixed feelings about it. Sometimes you're okay with it, sometimes you're not. So yeah. Yeah, so kind of like I mentioned with my own study, you can definitely be asexual and still want romance, which is something that I feel like lots of people struggle with because they do consider those to be the same thing, but there are two different components of our attractions, which is where the split attraction model comes into play. So this model acknowledges different orientations for different levels of attraction. So basically separating sexual feelings and romantic feelings to allow for different orientations. And this can be used to show what kind of relationships a person wants. And for romantic identities, there's yet another diverse group of them on a spectrum, more than I could list. Those asexual spectrum identities tend to have a romantic identity counterpart, so that's something to look into. I will kind of go over just the more common ones, but most of them do have a matching counterpart. And though people may assume...
Are you going to get into some examples of what you're talking about too?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, and then so though many people assume sexual and romantic orientations are the same, they don't have to be, kind of like we went over earlier. And so basically you can have an endless combination of sexual and romantic identities, whatever fits you from these labels, or no label if you want.
Okay.
So can you describe that little cartoon you've got to the side there?
Yeah, so this screen grab here is from BoJack Horseman. If anyone is familiar with the show, it gained a lot of attention in the asexual community because Todd Chavez in the red sweatshirt is one of the first like out asexual characters on a TV program. So he kind of goes into like, I don't think I'm allowed to be in love, and he kind of struggles with his identity through the series until he gets some acceptance from friends and realizes he can also like have romantic connections despite that. I actually opened my thesis with that quote, I don't think I'm allowed to be in love, so we reference the show directly. But yeah, it's been a really big deal in representation for the community. And I would love to see more of that in the media also, because unfortunately there's not too much, but this is at least one good example, and I would recommend the show.
Yeah, we've had a discussion in the past, in a prior episode, about how the media plays such a big part on, well, I'll say mainstreaming different concepts.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that asexuality is likely one of those concepts that has not been really presented to media very often.
Right, and you know, if it has, probably not very well, but this is actually a very good portrayal, and I think like the community was very happy with it and found a lot of it relatable. So I enjoyed watching the show at the time, like when I wrote my thesis, and I would recommend it. I mean, it's a good show overall, but also just for seeing asexual representation in the media, which we so rarely get.
And what was the name of the channel again?
BoJack Horseman.
BoJack.
It's on Netflix.
On Netflix.
All right.
Okay.
So like I mentioned as well, there's a lot of romantic orientations. Most of those sexual identities have a romantic counterpart, so I can't mention all of them, but some of the more common ones are heteroromantic, so romantically attracted to people of the opposite gender, homoromantic, romantically attracted to people of the same gender, biromantic, romantically attracted to people of multiple genders, panromantic, romantically attracted to people regardless of their gender, and then aromantic is lacking romantic attraction in general and a desire to pursue romantic relationships, which asexuality kind of gets conflated with aromanticism most of the time, since most people tend to assume sexual and romantic attractions are the same thing, but they don't have to be. Asexuals are capable of identifying in other romantic ways also.
Absolutely.
What is that green, white, gray, black flag?
That is the aromantic flag
Okay.
in the background. Just because that tends to be, a lot of asexuals are aromantic, yes, but not all of them. So there, you know, there can be a match there, but it doesn't have to be. So that's just important to mention.
Okay.
Yeah. So then, kind of some of the frequent questions about asexuality, and also relating to some of those stereotypes. Being asexual does not mean that you'll always be lonely. Lots of people think that, but you can have fulfilling romantic relationships if you so choose, or close friendships like anyone else. I don't like being asexual and want to be normal. What can I do? So this tends to be something a lot of asexual people struggle with due to societal stigma and, you know, wanting to be like everyone else. But it's not a choice or something to be fixed, and others have felt this way. So people questioning their identity or wanting to be normal, they're not alone in this. And there are many, as I mentioned, internet groups that you can go to for support with this and to meet other people who feel like you. I don't find anyone sexually attractive. Does that mean I'm asexual? So based on the broad definition of asexuality, yes, but only you can decide to use the label and identify in this way. So as we kind of mentioned, you don't have to use any label, but also it might be helpful to explore some resources to see if you identify with any of the many sub-labels underneath the spectrum that are out there. Identify as another orientation, but still fit the definition of asexuality. Am I wrong? So once again, no, you can use many labels to identify yourself. That's why a lot of asexuals in particular combine labels to indicate their sexual and romantic orientations. More so than other communities, they tend to make that distinction because they are considered like two different and separate and important parts of their identities. And then, I used to experience sexual attraction. Does this mean I'm not asexual? So not necessarily, because sexuality can be fluid. So this is still valid. Your attractions can change throughout life, and you can identify with any labels that suit you best at the time. And like I mentioned, there's some identities that are not completely asexual anyways. So there are room in some of these labels to have fluidity in attractions.
Can you give a couple of examples of people who identify as another orientation but still fit in the definition of asexual? How do they use those two labels? Like, what would some of the label combinations be, for instance?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, lots of people on the asexual spectrum tend to identify with their romantic orientations, or perhaps both. But a lot of the time, if they're asexual and say heteroromantic, homoromantic, biromantic, etc., they will tend to use that romantic label because that's more of something they have as opposed to the lacking in the sexual attraction. So that's kind of how those are used in conjunction, because it emphasizes sort of the part of relationships that they really want, the part that they are more attracted to per se. And like myself as an example, I tend to identify as like heteroromantic, gray sexual. I find a lot of the spectrum labels fit for me, but that's a good enough broad one. But that's kind of a living example of being interested in romantic relationships, but having this sort of fluctuating sexual attraction. And also, I mean, I know several other asexual people that do have romantic relationships have felt the same way. So it is possible to combine the two and have these relationships or experiences that most people think asexuals might not.
So let's talk more about the difference between a romantic relationship and a sexual relationship. I'm sure there's more differences than just the lack of a sexual act, but what types of things would make up a romantic relationship, for an example?
Yeah, I would say the sexual attraction and relationships aspect involves more of like the sexual behavior, physical attraction, and then romantic relationships being more about not only that sort of romantic love aspect, but also feeling emotionally connected to them. That sort of like deeper desire that goes like beyond needing that physical attraction, that they you know, are connected to this person on a deeper level.
I think that helps.
I guess a question I could ask is, for someone who is asexual but has a high desire for romance in whatever form that may occur. What sort of people would be their complement? Would it be another asexual person?
Yeah, so that's where it gets tricky, I guess. Because asexuals are such a small group of the population, it can be hard to find another asexual to be with. But some people, as I've read in the research or people I know, they tend to get into relationships, like they have romantic attractions, but they're asexual, and they might find somebody who's understanding and like set boundaries with that partner in terms of what they're willing to engage in. Others might engage in poly relationships for the other person to sort of pursue their needs in the relationship in a different way. Of course, some people might choose to want to sort of keep their dating options in the asexual realm, but like I said, that can be tricky. Maybe the most ideal, but it can be tricky just with the sort of limited access there. And overall, I just think it involves a lot of negotiation and understanding, communication, and being open about those feelings so everyone can get their needs met.
You mentioned something earlier that kind of ties in with what you just said. To answer the question about I don't like being asexual and want to be normal. So those people, being such a small portion of the population, don't have a lot of connection with more asexual people. But do you feel that some of the online things that you mentioned have maybe eased that problem a little bit, and that at in some way maybe the asexual people looking for asexual people are having a slightly easier time of doing it because of these online outlets, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, and I forgot to add as well to the last point, but some asexual people do engage in sexual behaviors like in their relationships, just like because they want to do it for their partner, because they care about them, for like people who like still want to have kids and they do it for that reason. So there's that as well. But yeah, I think with the online communities, it's easier to at least know people like you, feel not alone, and build some of that community. In terms of like maybe meeting those people or like relationship wise, I'm not quite sure, just because it's being with the internet and all, it's all over the world. So you might not necessarily have those people in your area or people that you know personally, but at least you can get involved in an online community, which is helpful, at least just for figuring things out and sharing with other people. There have been some attempts at asexual specific dating websites, but they're not very popular and not very user friendly, but they kind of make jokes about that as well in BoJack Horseman. But maybe someday in the future, there will be more access for that.
Yeah, I asked that question because in our line of work, both mine and Elizabeth's, we see what being of a certain sexuality or gender can do to you mentally and emotionally, and connection to like people is very, very important to easing that. And I wanted to ask that question because, we hopefully will have some ACE viewers, and information like this might be really important to them. To maybe they didn't know that there's some outlets for communication with other asexual people.
Maybe there's a group, or there's 10 people out there that want to get together and start talking about this, and they can do that. But
yeah, I agree. It's definitely been more of a sort of considered an online community for birth, and kind of where this all sprung up, but at least gives people some type of connection that they might not have otherwise had.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most resounding things outside of just people getting support. For instance, when they come to the PFLAG support meetings, they are looking for places to meet people who think like them, just in a social setting, without going to a bar or something like that. There's just, where do people go? And then there are very many dangers of being online, and especially with young people. And we're going to do a educational session about that down the road. How to stay safe by, when you're part of these online groups. Um, so it's a real challenge, especially in areas like Northwest Indiana where the LGBTQ population is not completely visible, or it may not be the most accepting environment in some of the um, cities, towns, or businesses. So that's one of the challenges we're facing. Any suggestions would be great. We are building a resource list, which will include, I know you have some resource links that you'll be sharing, and we'll be posting those as well. But
I have another question, and I'm hoping that you can help me out because I've never really done any research on my own to try to answer this question. Back in 2019, when we put on the very first Northwest Indiana Pride Festival, the people that we interacted with at our own festival, plus all of the schmoozing that we did at as many other Pride festivals as we could manage, there were many teens and younger people who we would talk to who would declare that they were ace.
mm-hmm.
And I just wonder if you have any insight or any feelings about the younger generations of folks.
Yeah, I mean, for one, yes, definitely like being safe online for them, especially. But I think at least like being, even if you don't talk to anyone, just researching online can be helpful. Um, but also, I think there's a lot of unfortunate stereotyping or poor phrases, I guess, when it comes to young people identifying this way, because you get a lot of the, oh, you just haven't found the right person yet, or, like, you'll like it with somebody else, or what if you want to have kids someday? Like, you get these kind of statements that are very harmful and kind of, you know, demonizing towards your label of choice, because just because you're young doesn't mean you can't know that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not about finding the right person or anything like that. You can still identify that way even if you've never had a relationship, sexual or romantic, at all. So I think that's like important to remember, because I feel like younger people might experience more of that stigma because they're seen as they don't have a lot of experience yet, or life experience, relationship experience, and it just kind of looked at like, oh, you're just saying that because you don't know what you want yet. But that's not really the case. So I think that's important to remember, that those labels are still valid. Like, that's kind of, I mean, I've heard that in my own life too, so like that's kind of one of my takeaways for like younger people, is just like trust in your own feelings. And also it can change, like we said, because sexuality can still be fluid.
And of course, my PFLAG hat on, acceptance is one of the most critical, fundamental needs that people have, not just LGBTQ people, but other people, everybody. And we talked a little bit earlier about some of the struggles that people go through when they do identify, somewhere on one of these spectrums. It's not because they identify on that spectrum, it's because either they or the people around them or society have said, that's not right. And that's not right. People should be respected for who they are. And that includes everything, inner and outer. And I think, that's just one of the things we're trying to do, is educate, which this presentation is doing, so that people develop a better understanding, so that maybe they can find some acceptance of people who are different from them, or even of their own selves. So it's really accepting somebody, validating their existence, their feelings, even if they're 3 years old. you know, and say, no, mommy, I'm supposed to be a boy, you know, or whatever the case may be. I think that's just so tremendously important. And
Yeah,
when,
I think that goes back a lot to the question of like, I don't like being asexual and I want it to be normal.
yes.
Like a lot of that feeling comes from because other people make you feel like it's not normal. So that's always kind of like, I mean, you know yourself better than anyone, so trust your own feelings and your labels. And then, especially for like youth too, it's not invalid because of your age. Or I think some adults too will sometimes, since I mentioned it's heavily an online community, like think it's just like some trendy new internet thing or like a phase, you know, that kids are going through. But this has always been something that exists, and it's just now with the internet that they've been able to talk about it and like bring awareness and meet people. So yeah, it's just a part of who you are, and that can change through age. It may not, but either way it's valid. So
well, we heard a question the other day. Somebody had said, why are there so many transgender people now that are, you know, they're so young and there's so many of them? Why aren't the older people transgender? And the response was, well, they are, they just either didn't have the language or it wasn't as accepted. You know, you think about, wow, you look back through history and, you know, perhaps a constant number of people have always been asexual. But now we're learning, you know, we're developing the language, people are becoming more self-aware and have the online resources and support. So it's more just a greater awareness rather than a surge in numbers.
And I think tied with that, and Alexandra mentioned it more than once about society, about the stigma. I am a staunch believer that the way we grew up and the way that our parents grew up is something that is mindlessly carried generation through generation. And I can tell you, myself sitting here, I am out to help try to break that. People are really just need to stop and think about everything instead of blindly following what someone told them. It's harmful. And it's certainly in this case where there is such a galaxy of orientations and genders that we need to get away from that. The binary is not the way it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And the results of not being accepted, I mean, you know, LGBTQ people everywhere. I don't know if you have specific stats on ACE people and suicide rates, but it's much higher amongst LGBTQ people and especially transgender people.
yeah, I have some notes about mental health. Nothing too specific in terms of persons, but at least sort of what impacts them the most, that I'll get into in a bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have like 10 more minutes we can go. So why don't you carry on? We'll get curious.
Yeah, just some quick resources. Asexual Visibility and Education Network, or AVEN, is like one of the biggest ones. It was kind of like the start of the asexual community online. And they have discussion boards and forums and like plenty of resources. That's where I got some of those questions from, like frequently asked questions. So I think that's really helpful. They also like post research on there, so they're like involved in bringing this community awareness. Also some other good ones, the LGBTA Wiki offers a lot of some of the identities I couldn't mention and some of the other like spectrum aspects of this. It's pretty comprehensive. The Trevor Project is always good. Whatisasexuality.com is another pretty good comprehensive resource. Planned Parenthood, that's kind of more of a youth focus or for parents. And then the Asexuality Archive is another very like more specific to asexuality and comprehensive resource. So and I will post these slides sometime on our social media soon, but there are some great resources out there for research and discovery and learning more about identities. So
That's great.
Thank you. Many of those I had not heard of before.
Yeah, some of them I hadn't either until I started looking for this. Aven tends to be the biggest one. And then, like I said, there are other social media kind of online communities as well, but these offer some more resources in terms of like research and academics and stuff. So
That's great.
yeah.
So you said you had some information you've put together outside of the presentation that you wanted to share as well?
Yeah, so some stuff from my past research and my experiences with my thesis. But some of the research literature, academic literature, it's unfortunately very limited because asexuality is very understudied. Research on asexuals really first began in 2004, which when you think about that is like so incredibly recent. So unfortunately, there's not as much there as I would like. But I mean, and that's part of why I studied what I did, so I could help contribute to that. But overall, they kind of started with some demographic research. So like I mentioned, that approximately 1% of the population, but it's likely higher if you had different samples for spectrum identities. And at that time, they found that asexuals are mostly women, religious, older, had poor health outcomes, low socioeconomic status and education, less experiences in long-term relationships. However, that's kind of only one perspective. So there's been some discrepancies on that in terms of demographics. Like for instance, most Aven users are educated white American middle-class females. So that's kind of in some ways the opposite. So ultimately we kind of need more research in that area, and also I think it at least points to the fact that this is a very diverse community. And I think that would only enhance too if more of the spectrum identities were discussed. And then of course, though they might lack relationships in general, they can still experience romance, be partnered for practical reasons, engage in sexual behavior, even if it's, you know, less often the case than maybe some other groups. Unfortunately, asexuality also tends to be unfairly pathologized and medicalized. So there is a disorder called hypoactive sexual desire disorder that tends to be conflated with asexuality. However, this should only be diagnosed if someone is distressed about their lack of sexual attraction, like maybe they had it and they lost it, they're not sure what's happening. But self-identification as an asexual sort of gets rid of that diagnosis. And asexuals, in the research, it's been found that they don't experience as much distress as those with HSDD. So it's another sort of unfair conflation of an LGBTQ identity with medical disorders. So that is something to keep in mind, as it could be when addressing those problems with someone, perhaps a professional, you would want somebody who is cognizant of asexuality, or it may be sort of misdiagnosed. And for mental health especially, like I mentioned, there's not as much research on this as I would like. As you know, a lot of asexuality studies have kind of focused on like demographics and what it is and just getting information out there. And we need some more specific stuff. But overall, they tend to have poor health outcomes, delayed menstruation, higher rates of depression and anxiety, and lower self-esteem. Actually, with identifying as asexual, they tend to have a better self-image. That label tends to help with increasing that. As I mentioned, with the societal stigma, that tends to impact self-esteem quite a bit. And they tend to also, asexuals, they found higher rates of social withdrawal, problems with anger control, to Elizabeth's point earlier, more suicidal ideation and suicidality. So that is still an issue. I don't have exact rates, but an issue in this community as well. And just feeling alienated, negative emotions generally, health problems, socially inhibited with other people. So that's kind of some of the mental health issues and physical health facing the community, which I think, and it's kind of seen as most of this occurs because of stigma, pressure to conform, being pathologized, negative stereotypes, it being hard to have relationships when some people are so judgmental about asexuality. So all in all, that can lead to a lot of these issues, as well as loneliness, social anxiety, depression, especially in youth feeling like they don't belong, in those in that sort of period of life, especially. So yeah, that's something I would also like to see more research about in the future, hopefully, because those high rates are there, much like other areas of the LGBTQ community, but it unfortunately just hasn't received the research attention that a lot of other areas have. So maybe that will, change in the future as we kind of get more of these studies going and more awareness about asexuality. And yeah, overall, just that even though asexuals kind of generally lack sexual interest and desire, that doesn't mean they lack those behaviors. That doesn't mean they lack romantic relationships. There's also been work that they have no differences in physical arousal patterns. Many asexuals still engage in solo sexual behaviors because they see that as different than doing so with a partner. So there's a lot of variability there, and a lot of things people don't usually think about asexuals, they can participate in and do. So that's always important for breaking some of those stereotypes when this research comes out.
So Alexandra, what gets this research started? You picked it up in your undergraduate years because there was a lack of it and you were interested and you wanted to do your part to help.
And she had a thesis to write.
Yeah, and she had a thesis to write. So what can our listeners do, or how can anything get started at the, is it a grassroots movement? Is it a university department movement? How does that work?
Yeah, I feel like at this point, it's been a lot of people at universities. And of course, when I'm reading this stuff, I'm referencing academic research I did in the past, in terms of like literature reviews. But it tends to kind of be, when it comes to niche topics like this, it tends to be the same group of researchers that kind of publish again and again on the same topic. A lot of this that I referenced is from the same kind of groups of authors, which can have its benefits and drawbacks, certainly. And I think it's at least gotten more attention online with Aven. They share research studies on their site that asexuals can participate in. Even also just like through universities, for those who are involved in those circles, you can find those studies to participate in. So there is like more awareness in that way, but I think it's still mostly focused on the academic realms. Okay. And even not a lot in comparison to other LGBTQ identities. Why some of them chose it, I don't know. I know why I chose it because it's my own identity, but what sort of got other people into researching it, because I would assume they're not all asexual, I would be curious to know. But I think it would be nice if we got more of them, especially to have some different perspectives from different researchers who might have new ideas or bring a diverse perspective.
Okay, well, we're getting a little close to time.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can go over what I did, but I don't know if you have time.
We back to 3 more episodes. Well, and actually we might, because you do have a series of other presentations you've been doing for us.
That's true.
Bisexuality spectrum and transgender, being intersex, pansexual.
Yeah.
So we've got a few coming up.
Or I can just try to make it fast if you want.
Yeah, talk really, really fast.
Because basically, yeah, my thesis I did with asexuals and in romantic relationships and with attachment orientation. So basically predicting that the more invested and satisfied they were, they would be more committed. And if they had better alternatives outside of the relationship, they would be less committed. My predictions on that were accurate, which matches research with the general population, well-established research, I might add. So, there's no reason to believe that asexuals would differ on aspects of attachment orientation compared to other people. What I was really proud of out of it is we got over 2,000 responses, which is the most I have ever seen out of an asexual study, because I've read a lot of them. So that was really cool. And though it was mostly women, there was a decent portion of people identified as non-binary, more so than men. And 16% of the sample was transgender, I believe, which I heard from other people was pretty high, actually, in terms of this kind of research. But still mostly cisgender, mostly white. And most of the sample was in romantic relationships. Some people responded and they were not. And it was mostly younger in age, which kind of points to our youth statement from earlier. But yeah, so, and the other part that I sort of enjoyed about it is I let people self-report their spectrum identities, because I found in the past research, of course, that it just tended to focus on asexuality exclusively. So when people were able to self-report as well, they could add in their romantic identities and lots of different labels. I think we had over 100 different identities mentioned, just in combinations of romantic labels, sexual labels, some people using more blanket terms like queer. So that was really amazing too. Like I said, there's a lot of diversity in the community that has not been recognized so much in the research. And then kind of my related study that got presented later on at the conference is basically that ace people who were, this was also based on my original data set. I collected a lot of data, too much to use for my thesis, but we worked with some of it later. So basically, ace people who are out to more people had higher life satisfaction and less internalized ace phobia. And higher internalized ace phobia predicted higher attachment anxiety, less life satisfaction, and less relationship satisfaction. Most of the people from the sample never felt physically or romantically attracted to others. And 50% of the sample I first identified as asexual between the ages of 18 and 24. So at least, half the sample kind of discovered this at a young age. So that's interesting to note.
Very interesting.
Yeah. That's my run through very fast of what I did, but.
And I think you said you had not published your work. I think it should be published.
Yeah, we were working on it, and then things get busy and everything, but yes, I agree. It was something I really enjoyed doing, and I won't be done working with that community. It'll always be a personal project and passion of mine.
So I would say if any of our viewers and listeners have questions or want to be involved or want to make connections, reach out to us and we can put you in contact with Alexandra or facilitate what we can here. So info at pflagcp-nwi.org or
LGBTQ NWI.org.
Info at,
sorry.
or you can message us through those platforms too. Alexandra, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
I learn something every time I hear this.
Absolutely.
I come up with more and more questions, and it just serves to help me grow as a person. So
your work is captivating. I'm glad that you did that for your thesis. I'm hoping that other people are going to pick up the torch and continue that good work. Or perhaps you'll spearhead that project.
Yep.
Yes, absolutely. It gave me many more ideas. Like I said, there's so much work to be done in this area in particular that I hope does get done because it's really necessary, especially when it comes to mental health. And
oh yes, people can really benefit from that. Well, we are going to not do
No, we won't
Okay.
do any news today since we're just about out of time. But I will say that there are many articles at lgbtqnation.com that people in the community should be reading, at least in the state of Indiana, not the least of which is that Indiana has asked the Supreme Court to strip parental rights from gay couples. And unfortunately, it looks like they may actually succeed. So I like LGBTQ Nation, mixture of good and bad news as always.
PFLAG National has a variety of resources too, human rights, the HRC, Trevor Project. So there's a lot of resources out there that we can point you to.
There's also sources for the statistics, which probably don't break out asexual community members specifically, but that are geared to give you the numbers for mental health issues and suicide rates and such things like that. I think HRC is one of them, and the Trevor Project as well.
Yep. So thank you again to the Bill and Callie Show and their sponsors. They make all this possible. If anybody out there listening is willing to be a sponsor, we're always looking for more for not only our show, but for other shows on the Bill and Callie Network.
That's all for tonight, folks.
All right.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Thank you for having me.
This episode of The Bill and Callie Show is brought to you by Sip Coffee House 2 in Highland, Indiana on Jewett Avenue. Great coffee, lattes, smoothies, and more. Food and treats you will adore. Small town charm with big city selection. It's Sip Coffee House 2.